We want to bring in our legal contributor, Tony Thedford, just to get his take on how this all unfolded. And first, a question for you, Tony. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Your reaction to would it be rapidness of this verdict, or just your reaction? The jury gets this today, right after closing arguments, and here we are with a guilty on all counts verdict.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I predicted that the verdict would be relatively quick. The evidence in the case was not actually voluminous. There were a lot of videos, obviously showing substantive parts of the incident. And so a jury simply had to decide whether or not they believed that Mr. Morgan was the person, first of all, on the video, and whether or not he acted in a manner that's consistent with the allegations in this case. So it should not have taken the jury that long to reach a verdict in this case. And a 3-hour verdict, although fast, again, was not unexpected here.
You said generally it's 1 hour per day of a trial, and that was about a 5-day trial. This was about 3 hours, 3.5 hours. But talk about the public defender saying that they should not have been pulled over in the first place, and the prosecutors did not really prove their case.
Well, in terms of not being pulled over in the first place, that none of this would have happened but for the officers essentially illegally pulling over the vehicle. That was an argument that the defense counsel made. Ultimately, though, the issue really had to do with whether or not the stop was illegal or not. It's still illegal, certainly, to fire upon officers. So I think that defense counsel was doing the best that they could with the pieces that they had in order to attempt to defend their client. Again, the evidence that the government had in this case was pretty overwhelming. And it really comes down, frankly, to this issue of sort of who did the shooting of Officer French because of where the injury occurred. There was some argument made in that space, and I think, frankly, that was the more effective argument relative to casting some sort of doubt as to whether her client or the defendant in this case was the actual shooter. But clearly the jury believed the government's presentation that Mr. Morgan was the shooter. And I think there was some suggestion that Officer French could have turned her head at this, when the gun was raised, or may have turned her head in some other fashion. We'll never know. But I think the core piece of information was really whether or not they believed that the shooting in the back of the head could have resulted from a second shooter or from someone else.
We had reporters in the courtroom throughout this case. Leah Hope covered this during most of the day for us. She had described it was that body cam video that really affected this jury noticeably, sometimes in tears. And his brother was there. Eric Morgan pleaded guilty in the fall to aggravated unlawful use of a weapon. Has been sentenced to 7 years. But we didn't hear, as far as I understand it, at all from him in this case. I just want to get your take on that guilty plea back in the fall. And did that have any impact, you think, on this case in any way?
Well, I don't. At the time of that guilty plea, I think there was a lot of reaction with everyone assuming that Eric should have been charged with first-degree murder as well. However, the facts of the case were that Eric allegedly was the driver of the vehicle and fled. So at the time of the shooting, he was not actually in proximity of the vehicle where the shooting, in the area of the vehicle where it occurred. So again, he pled guilty to what he could be charged with in this case, which was the weapons charge. The admission or any information relevant to that would not have been, frankly, admissible in this case or even relevant. Certainly, the defendant could have called his brother to testify if, in fact, they thought strategically that would help. But in terms of that outcome, although it's the same incident, the actions were so, frankly, unrelated that the outcomes for both of the brothers are consistent with, frankly, the facts in the case.
So Eric has been charged for 7 years in prison. Emonte is eligible for life in prison. What do you think will happen, and what do you think the judge will decide, Tony?
Well, this is an interesting issue because Mr. Morgan was 21 years old. A court has discretion in these sort of cases for a person 21 or younger who's charged with first-degree murder, where there is an aggravator or an enhancement. In this case, the statute calls for mandatory natural life if the defendant is charged with knowing that the deceased was a police officer. Police officers get special protection or special enhancements if a police officer is wounded, shot, or killed. So again, here, the expectation is that he would receive natural life. However, there are arguments to be made, and a court can, in its discretion, determine that natural life is not the appropriate sentence because there is some wiggle room here because of the age. So it will be interesting, and there is still a fight to be had in terms of specific sentencing. But it is probably likely that he would be sentenced to natural life.
Emonte Morgan's family briefly talked just a few minutes ago before you joined us, and I know you heard that. His grandmother making a reference to police crookedness and his mom making the claim of a cover-up and that her son will get justice. How would that even happen in a case like this? You would think there would be an appeal, but just your reaction to the family saying those things after a jury took fewer than 4 hours to decide otherwise.
Well, you know, there are two families here that have suffered tremendous loss. Obviously, the families of the officers, Officer French in particular, because she's deceased. The family of Officer Yanez, who's permanently injured, they're affected. But certainly the family of Mr. Morgan, they've lost someone. And so what you're hearing, I believe, are just reactions of family members who've lost a loved one. I do not believe that her positions regarding, the legal standards here are necessarily accurate, but again, she's certainly entitled to her opinion, and it is not unreasonable in my view for a mother to cry out for her son or to demand that the outcome be different because she's unhappy with it because she's lost her son. But I don't see a scenario where this is overturned based on what she suggested.
Watch breaking news on YouTube. Subscribe to ABC7 Chicago Eyewitness News.